In the heart of Manhattan, amidst the towering skyscrapers and holiday lights, Christopher Preston has it all: wealth, power, and prestige. But beneath his polished exterior lies an emptiness he can't quite name. For years, he's built his empire, measuring success by profits and accolades, not realizing how far he's drifted from the person he once was. Everything changes one winter afternoon when a young boy named Ethan Carter tugs on his coat and claims that Christopher's picture is in their family's photo album, standing beside someone Christopher hasn't thought about in years. Joe Carter, the owner of a small cafe who once gave him a lifeline during the hardest time of his life. What starts as a strange coincidence soon becomes an emotional journey that forces Christopher to confront his past and the choices that led him to where he is today. As memories of Joe's kindness resurface, Christopher is faced with a decision that could change not only his life, but the lives of those around him. Can a forgotten act of generosity spark a new beginning? Will Christopher find his way back to the things that truly matter before it's too late? The lobby of Preston Tower buzzed with energy, wrapped in the glow of holiday cheer. A towering Christmas tree stood proudly at the center, its branches heavy with silver ornaments and golden ribbon. Snowflakes clung to the coats of visitors as they hurried in from the cold. The faint hum of Christmas carols played over the speakers, blending with the hum of quiet conversations and the soft click of shoes against polished marble. Christopher Preston entered through the glass doors, indifferent to the festive scene before him. His tailored navy overcoat hung perfectly across his broad shoulders. His leather shoes gleamed as he strode toward the elevators, his briefcase tapping against his leg in rhythm with his brisk pace. Christopher was known for his focus. He was a man with no time for distractions, especially during the year-end financial rush. As he reached the elevator bank, he felt a small tug on his coat sleeve. It was a soft pull, not urgent, but insistent. Christopher stopped abruptly and turned, his sharp blue eyes landing on a boy standing just below shoulder height. "Excuse me, sir," the boy said, his voice steady despite his small frame. Christopher blinked, startled. The boy looked no older than 8, with wide green eyes that shone with curiosity. His round face was dusted with freckles, and wild blonde curls peeked out from under a gray knit beanie. He wore a bright red puffy coat that looked a size too big, his gloved hands buried in the oversized pockets. "Yes," Christopher said, his tone polite but distant. "Are you Christopher Preston?" the boy asked eagerly. Christopher's eyebrows lifted in surprise. "Yes, I am," he answered, glancing at the time on his sleek wristwatch. "And you are?" "My name is Ethan Carter," the boy replied proudly. "I saw your picture in our family photo album." Christopher stared at him, confused. "I think you must be mistaken. I do not know you." Ethan shook his head, his curls bouncing. "You do not know me, but you knew my grandpa, Joe Carter. You were in a picture with him, outside his cafe." Christopher's expression shifted. The name Joe stirred something faint but familiar, like the first few notes of a forgotten song. "You knew him," Ethan insisted, as if sensing Christopher's hesitation. Christopher felt a strange tightening in his chest. He cleared his throat. "Joe Carter," he murmured, as if testing the name. "Where is your mother, Ethan?" "She is cleaning offices upstairs," Ethan said. "I come with her after school sometimes." Christopher nodded. He had seen the maintenance workers moving through the halls at night, their presence as quiet as the hum of the building's air conditioning. "I have a meeting," Christopher said, taking a step toward the open elevator. "I hope you have a good day." "But wait," Ethan said, stepping forward to block Christopher's path. "You have to see the picture. I can show you." Christopher sighed. He was not used to being delayed, especially by a child. Yet something in Ethan's wide-eyed determination stopped him from brushing the boy off entirely. "Where is it?" Christopher asked, more to humor him than anything else. "Our apartment," Ethan answered immediately. It is only a few blocks from here." Christopher almost smiled at the boy's audacity. "I am afraid I do not have time for that," he said, gently but firmly. Ethan's face fell, his shoulders slumping beneath his oversized coat. "Grandpa Joe always said you would come back one day," Ethan said quietly. "He said you would remember." Christopher felt a jolt of something he could not name. The boy's words hit him harder than they should have. The elevator doors chimed, and a group of executives stepped out, nodding politely to their CEO. Christopher straightened, pushing the odd feeling aside. "Take care, Ethan," he said, stepping into the elevator. The doors slid shut with a quiet hum, sealing him away from the boy's earnest gaze. As the elevator ascended, Christopher caught his own reflection in the mirrored walls. His angular face, usually calm and composed, looked unusually unsettled. "Joe Carter," he whispered to himself. The name echoed in his mind like a bell. He shook his head and forced his thoughts back to the presentation he needed to review. By the time he reached his office on the top floor, he had nearly convinced himself that the encounter with Ethan had been nothing more than a curious interruption. Christopher's office was an expanse of glass and steel, perched high above the city like a sleek observatory. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the Manhattan skyline, now dusted in white from the falling snow. The room was pristine, designed for function and intimidation, not comfort. Melissa, his assistant, entered with her usual efficiency, placing a folder on his desk. "Your presentation slides are ready," she said, eyeing him carefully. "Would you like your usual coffee?" Christopher hesitated, something he never did. "Not yet," he replied. Melissa paused but said nothing, exiting as quietly as she had entered. Christopher leaned back in his leather chair, staring out at the snow-covered city below. But instead of the towering skyscrapers, all he could see was Ethan's freckled face and the mention of a cafe that had once felt like home. A memory tugged at the corners of his mind, a warm room filled with the smell of fresh coffee and the sound of a man's laughter. Joe Carter. The name no longer felt distant. It felt like a thread pulling him toward something buried deep inside. Christopher sat forward, running a hand over his face. He reached for the folder on his desk, trying to refocus, but the words blurred on the page. After 30 minutes of staring at the same paragraph, he stood abruptly and grabbed his coat. Before he could second-guess himself, he was back in the elevator, heading toward the lobby. When the doors opened, the hum of holiday music and the sight of the Christmas tree greeted him once more. Ethan was still there, perched on a bench near the entrance, swinging his legs and humming along to the carols. His beanie had slipped to one side, and his coat hung awkwardly off one shoulder. Ethan's face lit up the moment he saw Christopher. "You came back," he exclaimed, his eyes wide with surprise and triumph. Christopher cleared his throat, trying to sound indifferent. "I have a few minutes," he said. "Show me the photo you were talking about." Ethan beamed, hopping off the bench. He grabbed his coat and motioned for Christopher to follow. "It is not far. You are going to love it, I promise." As they stepped outside into the crisp winter air, Christopher could not help but wonder if the boy was right. Snow crunched under their feet as Christopher followed Ethan through the quiet streets. The air was sharp with cold, and the city seemed to hum with holiday energy, carolers on street corners, shop windows glowing with decorations, and laughter spilling out from a nearby cafe. Ethan walked with an eager bounce in his step, turning back every few seconds to make sure Christopher was still with him. "It is just around the corner," Ethan said, his breath puffing out in small clouds. "Our building has these old stone steps that creak when you go up. Mom says they are part of its charm." Christopher nodded absent-mindedly, his thoughts elsewhere. It had been years since he had walked through this part of the city on foot. The East Village had changed, new buildings, and trendy shops had replaced the small diners and mom-and-pop stores he remembered. But some things remained the same. The faint smell of roasted chestnuts from a street cart, the soft glow of string lights hanging above narrow alleys. Ethan stopped in front of a weathered brick building with ivy climbing up the sides. A narrow staircase led to a green door with chipped paint. The scent of something warm soup, maybe drifted from an open window above. "We live on the third floor," Ethan said, bounding up the steps. "Come on." Christopher hesitated. The last time he had been in a building like this, he was barely 18, desperate for any work he could find. He exhaled slowly and followed Ethan up the creaky stairs. Inside, the hallway was narrow and dimly lit. A small Christmas wreath hung on one of the doors, its red bow slightly frayed. Ethan unlocked their door with a key he pulled from his coat pocket and pushed it open. "Welcome to our place," he announced proudly. Christopher stepped inside and took in the small but cozy apartment. The living room was modest, with second-hand furniture and soft, warm lighting. Mismatched throw pillows covered the couch, and a small Christmas tree stood in the corner, its lights twinkling cheerfully. A handmade star made of foil and cardboard topped the tree. A stack of freshly folded laundry sat on the armrest of the couch, and a pair of worn work boots rested near the door. Ethan kicked off his shoes and ran to a tall cabinet near the window. "The photo album is in here," he said, opening the cabinet doors. Christopher stepped forward, suddenly feeling out of place. The apartment was filled with the quiet signs of a life built with care-framed photos on the wall, a jar of crayons on the table, and the soft hum of a heater struggling against the cold outside. "Here it is," Ethan exclaimed, pulling out a thick, worn photo album. The leather cover was faded and creased at the edges. He flipped through the pages quickly until he reached a Polaroid photo that had been carefully taped in place. "There," Ethan said, holding it up for Christopher to see. Christopher's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the picture. It was him. He looked younger, barely out of his teens, wearing a white apron over a t-shirt. His hair was slightly messy, his face thinner, but there was no mistaking it. It was him. He was standing beside a middle-aged man with a kind smile and a stocky build. The man's arm was draped over Christopher's shoulders, and they were both grinning. Behind them was the unmistakable backdrop of a diner red leather booths, a jukebox in the corner, and a chalkboard with the words "Special, Homemade Chili and Pie" scrawled across it in chalk. Written in loopy handwriting at the bottom of the photo were the words, "Chris and Joe, 1995. Christopher felt a wave of memories rush over him, the scent of sizzling bacon, the clatter of dishes, and Joe's familiar laugh as he flipped pancakes on the griddle. "You knew my grandpa, didn't you?" Ethan asked quietly, as if sensing the change in Christopher's expression. Christopher nodded slowly. "Yes, I did." His voice was softer now, almost reverent. "He was a good man." Ethan beamed. "Grandpa always talked about you. He said you worked at the diner for almost a year. He said you were his best worker." Christopher swallowed hard. "Your grandfather took a chance on me when no one else would," he said. "I was going through a rough time." Ethan sat cross-legged on the floor, listening intently. "Grandpa said you never gave up, even when things were tough." Christopher felt a lump form in his throat. He remembered how lost he had felt back then, his mother working double shifts to make ends meet, his father gone, and his dreams of college slipping further away. He had walked into Joe's diner one cold afternoon, desperate for work, any work. Joe had taken one look at him and said, "The grill's hot, kid. You up for it?" Joe had given him more than a job, he had given him a lifeline. "I didn't know he kept this," Christopher murmured, staring at the photo. Ethan smiled proudly. Grandpa kept everything that was important to him. Christopher felt the weight of the photo in his hands, as if it carried more than memories. It carried all the kindness and belief that Joe had poured into him when he needed it most. "Thank you for showing me this," Christopher said, handing the album back to Ethan. "Do you want to stay for dinner?" Ethan asked suddenly, his green eyes wide with hope. "Mom makes the best spaghetti, I promise." Christopher hesitated, his hand on the door. The scent of something simmering in the kitchen reminded him of how Joe used to insist on feeding him before the night shift. He almost said yes, but the old instincts kicked in: responsibilities, meetings, expectations. Maybe another time, he said with a faint smile. Ethan's shoulders drooped slightly, but he nodded. Okay. Christopher stepped out into the cold evening air, but something stayed with him: the warmth of that small apartment, the sight of the Polaroid, and the memories of Joe's diner. As he walked back to Preston Tower, the snow fell softly around him, muffling the city's noise. And in the quiet, Joe's voice echoed in his mind. "Do not forget where you came from, kid." Christopher knew now that he never truly had. The wind stung Christopher's face as he walked back to Preston Tower, the snow swirling gently around him. The streets were busy with last-minute holiday shoppers and couples clutching hot cocoa, but Christopher barely noticed. His thoughts were tangled with memories he had not revisited in years. By the time he reached his building, he realized that the warmth of the lobby felt hollow compared to the cozy, cluttered charm of the Carter's apartment. He loosened his scarf and headed straight to his office. Melissa, his assistant, looked up from her desk, surprised. "You are back early, Mr. Preston. Did your meeting end sooner than expected?" Christopher paused, considering how to answer. "Something came up," he said finally. "Hold my calls for the next hour." Melissa nodded, though she still gave him a curious glance. Christopher shut the door behind him, the quiet hum of his office enveloping him. He walked to the massive windows and stared out at the snow-dusted skyline. Normally, the sweeping view gave him a sense of pride. Now, it felt distant. He thought of Joe of the diner, filled with warmth, laughter, and the scent of fresh coffee. He could almost hear the clinking of plates, the jukebox in the corner playing an old country song. Christopher pulled out his phone and opened the search engine. His fingers hesitated before typing, "Joe's Cafe, East Village." The first result made his heart sink. The old address was now listed as an empty lot, marked for redevelopment. Christopher rubbed a hand over his face, guilt creeping in like a slow tide. He had been too caught up in building his empire to look back, and now the place that had once saved him was gone. He leaned back in his chair, eyes drifting to the ceiling. Memories from his teenage years came rushing in his mother's weary face after another double shift, the stack of overdue bills on the kitchen table, the bitter cold that seeped into their tiny apartment. And then, Joe. At 18, Christopher had been bitter and desperate, carrying the weight of his family's struggles on his narrow shoulders. He had wandered into Joe's Cafe that winter afternoon, frozen to the bone and ready to beg for a job. Joe had been standing behind the counter, wiping down a plate. His round face broke into a warm grin when he saw Christopher. "Grill's hot, kid," Joe had said, sliding an apron toward him. "You up for it?" Christopher had stared, stunned. He had not even asked yet. Joe's kindness had been a lifeline, as steady as the diner's hum. Christopher had worked long hours there, washing dishes, learning how to flip burgers, and eventually managing the register. Joe never asked questions about his home life, but somehow he knew. He fed Christopher when he worked late and gave him small advances when money was tight. "You are tougher than you think," Joe used to say whenever Christopher struggled. "But do not be so tough that you forget to live." Christopher blinked back the sting in his eyes and turned from the window. The weight of Joe's kindness settled in his chest. Joe had believed in him when no one else did. And what had Christopher done in return? He had left and never looked back. His eyes drifted to his laptop. He could not shake the image of Ethan's eager face as he showed him the photo album, proud of the man who had once shaped both of their lives. Joe had kept that photo all those years. He had believed that Christopher would come back. Christopher pulled up his schedule, glancing at the back-to-back meetings lined up for the next few days. He was supposed to fly to Chicago after Christmas for a corporate summit. His calendar was booked solid through the new year, but suddenly, None of it felt important. He picked up the phone and called Melissa. "Melissa," he said, his voice steady but quieter than usual. "Can you track down the ownership records for a property in the East Village? It used to be called Joe's Cafe." There was a brief pause. "Of course," Melissa replied, her tone professional but cautious. "Is this for a new investment?" Christopher hesitated. "No," he said, "it is personal." The next morning, Christopher stood in front of the empty lot where Joe's Cafe had once stood. Snow coated the ground in a pristine layer, and the only sign of life was the faint imprint of passing footsteps. The lot was fenced off, its corners marked with faded signs that read, "Under Review." The bright, welcoming neon sign that had once read Joe's Cafe was long gone, replaced by a cold vacancy. Christopher's breath fogged in the air as he stared at the space. He could still picture it clearly, the red leather booths, the worn counter where Joe kept a jar of candy for the neighborhood kids, the chalkboard with daily specials scrawled in Joe's lopsided handwriting. He could not change the fact that Joe was gone, nor could he undo the years of silence. But standing there, he realized something else. It was not too late to honor the man who had changed his life. Christopher exhaled slowly and reached for his phone. Later that day, Melissa placed a folder on Christopher's desk. "The property is still owned by your company," she said. "It was purchased during a block acquisition 4 years ago." Christopher nodded, barely hearing her. "Are you planning to sell it?" Melissa asked hesitantly. Christopher shook his head. "No," he said, closing the folder. "I am going to rebuild it." Melissa's eyes widened. "Rebuild? The cafe?" Christopher looked up, and for the first time in a long time, he smiled a real, genuine smile. "Yes," he said, "exactly as it was." Melissa hesitated, then nodded. "I will start making calls," she said. "We will need contractors, designers." Christopher held up a hand. "I want it done right. Keep it simple. Local builders, local artists. And keep this off the books. It is not about profit." Melissa gave a small nod of understanding. "I will make sure it is handled quietly." "Thank you," Christopher said sincerely. As Melissa left, Christopher leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. The task ahead felt daunting, but for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of purpose that had nothing to do with corporate success. Rebuilding Joe's Cafe would not erase the past, but it was a step toward making things right. As the snow fell outside Preston Tower, Christopher felt the weight of the photo in his mind, a reminder of a promise he had unknowingly made to a man who had believed in him. The next morning, sunlight streamed through Christopher's office windows, casting long streaks of pale gold across the pristine floor. The city below buzzed with its usual rhythm, but Christopher barely noticed. His mind was fixed on the project ahead, rebuilding Joe's Cafe. He had spent so many years chasing bigger deals, acquisitions, and expansions that he had forgotten what it felt like to build something meaningful, not for profit, but for people. This was different. He sipped his coffee slowly, staring at the blueprint sketches Melissa had sent over that morning. They were simple outlines of the property, as it currently stood, an empty lot surrounded by faded fences. It was almost painful to see the absence where so many memories had lived. Melissa knocked softly on the door and entered, a pen and notepad in hand. "I spoke to a few contractors who specialize in restoring vintage spaces," she said. "They can start as soon as next week." Christopher nodded, still studying the blueprints. "Good. I want the booths, the counter, the jukebox, everything to feel the way it used to." Melissa hesitated for a moment. "Are you sure you want to rebuild it exactly as it was?" Christopher glanced up, his blue eyes steady. "Yes, Joe's Cafe was more than just a place to eat. It was a place where people felt like they belonged. I do not want it to become something sterile or trendy." I want it to feel like home. Melissa gave a small nod. Understood. I will handle it. Christopher leaned back in his chair after she left, letting out a slow breath. He thought about Ethan and how excited the boy had been to talk about his grandfather's cafe. Ethan deserved to see the place that had meant so much to his family restored, alive, and full of the same warmth it had once held. But doubt gnawed at him. Was this really enough to honor Joe's memory? Could he ever repay the kindness Joe had shown him? A few days later, Christopher visited the East Village lot again. This time, a few workers were there, setting up equipment and marking measurements in the snow-covered ground. He watched silently as they unloaded supplies, his heart tightening at the sight. A voice called out from behind him. "Mr. Preston?" Christopher turned to see a man with a clipboard, bundled in a thick jacket and knit cap. His face was weathered but kind. "My name is Greg," the man said, extending his hand. "I run the construction team. Just wanted to introduce myself and let you know we are ready to get started." Christopher shook his hand. "Thank you, Greg. I appreciate it." Greg gave a small nod and glanced at the lot. "You know, when I first saw the plans, I thought to myself, this feels familiar. I used to come here when it was Joe's Cafe. Best coffee in the neighborhood." Christopher's gaze softened. "It was more than just coffee," he said quietly. "It was a second home for a lot of people." Greg smiled. "You are right about that. I remember Joe. Good man. Always had a kind word for everyone. He helped a lot of people, even when he was struggling himself." Christopher felt the weight of Greg's words. Joe's legacy was more than just a building or a menu. It was the kindness he had poured into every interaction, every small gesture of support. "We are going to do this right," Christopher said, his voice firm. "It has to feel like Joe's." Greg nodded, his respect evident. "We will make it happen." The days passed in a blur of decisions and meetings. Christopher poured himself into the project, visiting the lot every day to check on the progress. He worked closely with the design team, rejecting anything that felt too modern or impersonal. He insisted on finding red leather booths, just like the ones Joe had. And when he heard that the original jukebox had been sold to a collector, he made it his mission to track it down. Melissa watched all of this with a mix of admiration and surprise. Christopher Preston was known for his sharp business sense and relentless drive, but she had never seen him this focused on something so personal. One afternoon, Melissa approached him with a folder. "I found some of Joe's old customers," she said. "They have stories about the cafe memories they were happy to share. I thought it might help you bring the place to life again." Christopher took the folder and flipped through the printed pages. There were handwritten letters and typed notes, each one filled with heartfelt anecdotes about Joe and his cafe. One woman wrote about how Joe would offer free soup to anyone who seemed down on their luck. A man recalled how Joe had let him work for tips when he was between jobs. Christopher's chest tightened as he read. He had always known Joe was kind, but seeing the impact of his generosity on so many lives felt overwhelming. He picked up the last page, a simple note from an elderly man named Frank. "Joe never let anyone walk away hungry, not in body or in spirit. He made us feel like family." Christopher sat back in his chair, the paper trembling slightly in his hands. He had spent years building a corporate empire, but in the end, the greatest legacy belonged to a man who had built a home for strangers. One evening, Christopher returned to the Carters' apartment. Ethan greeted him at the door, his eyes lighting up with joy. "Mr. Preston, you came back." Christopher smiled, crouching to meet the boy's eye level. "Call me Chris," he said, "and I wanted to check in on something." Ethan pulled him inside eagerly. "Mom just made cookies. You have to try one." Anna Carter appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Mr. Preston," she said, with a surprised but warm smile. "This is unexpected. Chris," he corrected gently. Anna smiled. "All right, Chris. Please, make yourself at home." As the scent of warm cookies filled the room, Christopher felt a strange but comforting sense of familiarity. Over cups of hot chocolate, they talked about Joe and the old cafe. Ethan described how he had imagined it in his mind, cozy, cheerful, and full of laughter. Anna shared stories of how her father had worked tirelessly to keep the place open, even during hard times. Christopher listened, feeling more grounded than he had in years. Finally, he cleared his throat. "I wanted to tell you both something. I have started rebuilding Joe's cafe." Anna's eyes widened. "You... what?" "It is going to be just like it was," Christopher said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I want it to be a place where people feel at home again, where they remember what Joe meant to all of us." Ethan's face lit up. "Grandpa would love that," he said, bouncing in his seat. Anna's expression softened as tears filled her eyes. "I do not know what to say," she whispered. Christopher reached for her hand. "Say yes, and tell me what else I can do to honor him." Anna nodded, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, and thank you." Christopher felt something settle in his heart, a quiet certainty that he was finally on the right path. The warmth of the Carters' apartment lingered with Christopher long after he left. The scent of fresh cookies and the sound of Ethan's laughter followed him as he walked through the snowy streets. He had spent years in pristine boardrooms and luxury penthouses, but nothing compared to the feeling of sitting at their small table, sharing simple stories and memories. For the first time in years, Christopher felt like more than just a businessman. He felt like himself. The next morning, he arrived at the construction site early. Snow still blanketed the sidewalks, and the city was just waking up. Greg was already there, bundled in his thick coat, reviewing the new deliveries. "Morning, Mr. Preston," Greg greeted him, though his tone was more casual now, less formal. They had started to work in sync over the past few days. "Morning, Greg," Christopher replied. He stepped up to the fenced lot and stared at the progress they had made. The foundation was nearly complete, the frame of the cafe beginning to take shape. It was no longer just an empty space, it was becoming something real, something alive. Greg followed his gaze. "It's coming along," he said. "We should have the walls up before the new year." Christopher nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. "It looks good." Greg hesitated before speaking again. "You know, you don't see CEOs out in the cold, checking on builds like this." Christopher looked at Greg, his breath fogging in the morning air. "This isn't just a project, Greg. It's personal." Greg gave a knowing nod. "That much is clear." He paused, then added, "Joe would be proud." The simple statement hit Christopher harder than he expected. He swallowed the sudden tightness in his throat and gave Greg a small nod before stepping away. That afternoon, Christopher returned to his office to find a message from Anna Carter waiting for him. "Hi, Chris. Ethan has not stopped talking about the cafe since you visited. He even drew a picture of what he thinks it will look like when it's done. If you're free tomorrow evening, we'd love to have you over for dinner. Just something simple. Thanks again for everything." Christopher read the message twice, then a third time, a slow smile spreading across his face. Anna's invitation felt sincere, not out of obligation, but out of genuine gratitude and maybe friendship. He sent a quick reply, "I'd be honored. See you at 6." The next evening, Christopher arrived at the Carters' apartment with a bottle of sparkling cider and a tin of pastries from a bakery he had passed on the way. The elevator ride up felt different this time, lighter somehow, as if the weight of his usual schedule had eased. Ethan was the first to greet him, flinging the door open with a grin. "You came," Christopher laughed, stepping inside and brushing the snow from his coat. "I told you I would." Anna appeared, her smile warm as she wiped her hands on her apron. "Hi, Chris. Come in. Make yourself comfortable. Dinner is almost ready." The apartment was filled with the scent of tomato sauce simmering and garlic bread fresh from the oven. Ethan led Christopher to the small couch, where a stack of papers and crayons lay scattered. "Look!" Ethan said, holding up a drawing of the cafe. The picture was bright and colorful, with a big neon sign that read, Joe's Cafe in bold letters. Inside, he had drawn stick figures of people sitting at booths and holding steaming mugs of coffee. That's you behind the counter, Ethan explained, pointing to a figure in a tie. And that's Grandpa, smiling at everyone. Christopher's chest tightened. It's perfect, he said sincerely. You've captured it exactly. Ethan beamed, pleased with the praise. Anna called from the kitchen. Dinner's ready. The table was small but set with care plates of spaghetti and meatballs, fresh bread, and a small salad. Christopher took his seat, feeling unexpectedly at home. Thank you for inviting me, he said as Anna passed him a serving dish. We're the ones who should be thanking you, Anna replied. You've given us something to look forward to. Christopher's gaze softened. I should have come back sooner, he admitted. Your father meant so much to me. He gave me a chance when I didn't think I had one. Anna nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. That's who he was. He saw the good in people before they saw it in themselves. They ate quietly for a few moments, letting the weight of the conversation settle. Ethan, however, could not sit still for long. Mom says the cafe will be done soon. Can I help when it opens? Christopher smiled at the boy's enthusiasm. Of course. I'll need a good assistant to greet customers. What do you think? Ethan puffed out his chest. I'll be the best assistant ever. Anna laughed, shaking her head. You've created a monster. Christopher laughed too, feeling lighter than he had in weeks. After dinner, they sat together in the living room with mugs of hot chocolate. Ethan curled up next to Christopher, asking endless questions about what the cafe would serve, what music would play on the jukebox, and whether they could put up Christmas decorations every year. Christopher answered every question, picturing the cafe alive and bustling, filled with warmth and laughter. At one point, Anna's voice softened. Chris, I have to ask, why are you doing this? He looked up from his mug, surprised. To honor Joe, he said simply. Anna nodded but pressed gently. And for you? Christopher hesitated. For a long time, I thought success was measured in profits and growth things you can count. But Joe taught me that the real measure of success is the people whose lives you touch. Anna's expression softened. My dad would have agreed with that. Christopher looked around the small but vibrant room, the family photos on the walls, the handmade decorations, and the messy pile of Ethan's drawings. This was what mattered. Not luxury, but connection. As the night wound down, Christopher stood to leave. Ethan tugged at his sleeve. You'll come back again, right? Christopher knelt to meet Ethan's eyes. I promise. Ethan hugged him tightly before letting him go. Good night, Chris, Anna said at the door. Good night, he replied, stepping out into the snow-covered street. The cold air bit at his face, but Christopher barely noticed. His heart was full in a way it had not been in years. As he walked home, the thought echoed in his mind. It's not just about rebuilding the cafe. It's about rebuilding what I almost forgot I had. The next morning, Christopher woke up earlier than usual. Sunlight filtered through the large windows of his penthouse, casting a soft glow on the minimalist decor. His place was immaculate glass, steel, and polished wood, but as he walked through the silent rooms, it felt hollow. He brewed a cup of coffee and stood by the window, staring out at the city below. The memory of dinner with Anna and Ethan filled his mind, the warmth of their home, the laughter, the simple conversation. The contrast made him realize how much he had been missing. He set the coffee mug down and grabbed his coat. There was work to be done. By the time Christopher arrived at the construction site, the team was already busy framing the walls of the cafe. Greg waved from across the lot, his breath fogging in the cold morning air. Looking good, boss, Greg called out, his usual grin visible beneath his scarf. Christopher walked through the half-built structure, imagining how it would look when it was finished. The wooden beams formed the skeleton of the cafe, but in his mind, He could already see the booths lining the walls, the glowing jukebox in the corner, and the chalkboard above the counter with the daily specials written in Joe's familiar handwriting. Greg walked up beside him, clipboard in hand. "We're ahead of schedule," he said. "Should have the roof done by next week." Christopher nodded. "Good. I want everything ready before New Year's. This place means a lot to the people who remember it." Greg studied him for a moment. "It means a lot to you too, doesn't it?" Christopher's gaze softened. "More than I realized." Greg gave a small nod of understanding. "You know, I've worked on a lot of projects, but this one feels different. Feels important." Christopher smiled faintly. "It is." Later that afternoon, Christopher walked through the East Village, stopping at a small antique store tucked between two brownstones. He pushed the door open, and a bell chimed above him. The shop was filled with shelves of vintage items, old radios, lamps, and dusty records. At the counter, an older woman with wire-framed glasses greeted him with a curious smile. "Looking for something special?" she asked. Christopher took a deep breath. "A jukebox. Something classic." The woman's eyes lit up. "You're in luck. We have one in the back. It's an old Seaberg from the 60s. Needs a little work, but it still plays." She led him to the back of the store, where the jukebox stood like a forgotten relic. It was tall, with chrome accents and colorful lights dulled by age. Christopher ran his hand across its surface, feeling a surge of nostalgia. "It's perfect," he said. "I'll take it." The next few weeks passed in a blur of progress. The cafe took shape, piece by piece. Red leather booths were installed, the countertops were polished, and the walls were painted a warm cream color that reminded Christopher of the old diner's glow. Local artists painted cheerful murals on the walls, and Christopher personally oversaw the placement of the jukebox in the corner. He even made sure the song list included some of Joe's favorites: country ballads, jazz standards, and a few Christmas classics. But despite the steady progress, doubt continued to linger at the edges of Christopher's mind. Would this truly honor Joe's legacy? Was he doing enough? One evening, Christopher returned to the Carters' apartment, holding a large, flat package under his arm. Ethan opened the door, his face lighting up as always. "Chris!" Ethan exclaimed. "Is the cafe almost ready?" "Almost," Christopher said with a smile. "But I brought you something." Ethan's eyes widened as Christopher handed him the package. The boy tore off the brown paper, revealing a framed sketch of the cafe done in clean pencil lines, with soft shading that brought it to life. The sign above the door read Joe's Cafe, glowing softly against the night sky. Ethan stared at it, his expression filled with awe. "You drew this?" Christopher nodded. "I used to sketch a lot when I was younger. Joe used to keep my doodles behind the counter." Ethan looked up, his smile wide. "It's amazing." Anna appeared behind Ethan, drying her hands on a kitchen towel. "What's all this?" Ethan held up the drawing proudly. "Chris made this for us." Anna's gaze softened as she took in the sketch. "It's beautiful," she said quietly. "You've really thought of everything." Christopher rubbed the back of his neck, suddenly self-conscious. "I wanted you both to have a preview. I hope it looks the way Joe would have wanted." Anna stepped closer. "It's not just about how it looks, Chris. It's about what it means." Christopher nodded, her words settling in his heart. That night, as he walked back to his penthouse, Christopher felt a shift within him. For so long, he had measured his success by numbers: revenue growth, quarterly performance reports, and market expansion. But now he understood that true success was measured in the lives you touched and the legacies you carried forward. The cafe was nearly complete when Christmas Eve arrived. The snow fell steadily, blanketing the city in a quiet stillness. The warm glow of holiday lights reflected off the fresh snow, making the streets look like something out of a storybook. Christopher stood outside the cafe's front door, staring up at the new neon sign. It was an exact replica of the original Joe's Cafe, glowing in cheerful red and yellow letters. His heart swelled as he imagined what Joe would say if he could see it now. "The grill's hot, kid. You up for it?" Christopher smiled at the memory, then pulled out his phone and dialed Anna's number. "Hi, Anna," he said when she answered. "I have something I'd like to show you and Ethan tonight." Anna's voice was curious, but warm. "Is this another surprise?" "Kind of," Christopher said with a laugh, "but I think you'll like it." An hour later, Christopher stood outside the Carters' apartment as the door swung open. Ethan rushed out, bundled in his puffy red coat, practically vibrating with excitement. Anna followed close behind, her red scarf wrapped snugly around her neck. "Where are we going?" Ethan asked, tugging on Christopher's coat. "You'll see," Christopher said, his smile widening as he led them down the snowy street. When they turned the final corner, Anna gasped softly. The cafe stood before them, its windows glowing with warm light, the neon sign casting a soft glow on the snow below. Ethan froze, his eyes wide with wonder. "Is that—" "Welcome home," Christopher said quietly. Anna's eyes filled with tears as she took in the familiar sight. Ethan grabbed his mother's hand, bouncing with excitement. "Can we go inside? Please?" Anna nodded, wiping her eyes. "Yes." Christopher unlocked the door and pushed it open, stepping aside to let them in. The smell of fresh paint and polished wood filled the air, but beneath it all was the familiar scent of coffee brewing. The jukebox hummed softly in the corner, playing a gentle holiday tune. Ethan ran to the counter, touching everything with wide-eyed awe. "It's just like Grandpa's stories," he said. Anna stood in the middle of the room, her hand pressed to her heart. "Chris, this is incredible." Christopher's throat tightened as he watched their joy. "This place, it was never just a cafe to me," he said. "It was home, and I wanted to share that with you." Anna smiled through her tears. "You've done more than that, Chris. You've brought him back." Ethan darted over to the jukebox and flipped through the song list. "Look, it has Grandpa's songs!" Christopher laughed, feeling the warmth of the moment settle in his chest. "Pick one," he said. Ethan pressed a button, and the familiar tune of "Rockin' Around the Christmas Tree" filled the cafe. Anna took a deep breath, and for a moment they stood together, soaking it all in the music, the memories, and the joy of something brought back to life. Christopher watched as Ethan danced and laughed, his heart full in a way he hadn't felt in years. And in the glow of the cafe's lights, Christopher knew this was where he belonged. The cafe was alive again. The soft glow of the Neon Joe's Cafe sign lit up the street, drawing curious glances from neighbors and passers-by. Inside, the warm hum of conversation mixed with the holiday music from the jukebox as Christopher, Anna, and Ethan sat together in one of the booths. Ethan was practically bouncing in his seat, his excitement boundless. "This is the best Christmas ever," he declared, taking another sip of his cocoa. Anna reached over and smoothed his curls, her smile soft. "Your grandpa would have been so proud of this place," she said, glancing around at the booths, the countertops, and the cheerful mural painted on the wall. Christopher's heart swelled at her words. "He was proud of you too, Anna. You and Ethan are the reason I came back." Anna's eyes met his, and for a moment there was nothing but understanding between them. She nodded, a quiet emotion in her gaze that spoke louder than words. The door chimed as someone entered, and Christopher turned to see Greg walking in, brushing snow off his shoulders. "Hey, boss," Greg said with a grin. "Place looks incredible." Christopher stood and walked over, clapping Greg on the shoulder. "You helped make it happen? I couldn't have done it without you." Greg's grin widened. "Merry Christmas, Chris. And thanks for bringing this back. I think the neighborhood's been missing it more than we realized." Christopher nodded, his chest tightening with emotion. As Greg walked to the counter to grab a coffee, the door chimed again. This time, it was a middle-aged woman wrapped in a thick coat, her face flushed from the cold. She stopped short as she took in the cafe, her eyes widening in surprise. "No way," she whispered. "Is this Joe's cafe?" Christopher stepped forward. "It is," he said, smiling. Tears sprang to the woman's eyes as she scanned the room. "I used to come here every morning before work. Joe always saved me a seat at the counter. He used to say, 'Margie, you look like you need an extra biscuit today.'" She laughed through her tears. He was right. I always did. Christopher's smile softened. We tried to keep it just the way he had it. "Welcome back, Margie." Margie wiped her eyes and took a deep breath. "I can't believe it's back." As she took a seat, others began to gather outside, drawn by the lights and the soft music. One by one, they stepped inside, some with hesitant curiosity, others with bright recognition. A man in his 60s walked straight to the jukebox, running a hand across the polished surface. "I remember this thing," he said, his voice rough with nostalgia. "Joe used to say, 'Pick a song and sit a spell.'" Christopher watched as the cafe filled with life. Neighbors greeted each other, old friends exchanged hugs, and families gathered at the booths. The sound of laughter and conversation filled the air, just like it had all those years ago. Anna walked over and stood beside him, her gaze sweeping across the room. "It's amazing," she whispered. Christopher exhaled slowly. "This is how it was supposed to be." Anna smiled. "You brought it back, Chris. You gave people a place to belong again." Just then, Ethan tugged on Christopher's sleeve. "Chris, can I take orders?" Christopher chuckled and ruffled Ethan's hair. "Sure, but remember, the first rule of customer service: be kind, and always listen." Ethan grinned and grabbed a notepad from behind the counter, hurrying over to Margie's table. "What can I get for you, ma'am?" Margie laughed and handed Ethan her order. "I'll have a coffee, extra biscuits." As Ethan ran back to the kitchen, Anna watched him with a mixture of pride and joy. "He's already got your work ethic," she said. Christopher's expression softened. "He reminds me of me, only a lot smarter." Anna's laughter was warm, and Christopher felt the familiar pull of something he had not felt in years: belonging. As the evening went on, more people arrived, filling the cafe with warmth and joy. Christopher made his way to the counter, poured himself a coffee, and took it to a booth near the window. He watched the snow fall outside, the scene peaceful and bright. For a while, he simply sat and listened, letting the hum of voices wash over him. This was what he had been missing all those years in the sterile quiet of his office. Not just the success of building something, but the joy of sharing it with others. Greg slid into the booth across from him, a grin still plastered on his face. "So, what's next for you, Chris?" Christopher took a sip of his coffee, thoughtful. "I think I need to slow down, reconnect with the things that matter." Greg nodded. "I can see that. You've built a lot of things in your life, but this feels different." "It is," Christopher agreed. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching as Ethan ran from table to table, delivering hot cocoa and cookies to the new customers. His excitement was contagious. Every smile he received in return seemed to make him glow. "You really brought something special back," Greg said, his tone quieter now. Christopher nodded, the truth settling in his heart. By the time the evening began to wind down, the cafe felt like a homecoming for everyone who walked through the door. Ethan was still running around, his cheeks flushed from excitement, while Anna helped a group of friends near the counter. Christopher stood and clapped his hands gently to get everyone's attention. "Thank you all for coming tonight," he said, his voice steady but warm. "This cafe meant a lot to Joe and to me. I hope it will mean something to all of you too. Merry Christmas, and welcome back to Joe's Cafe." The room erupted in applause, and Christopher's heart swelled with pride. Anna stepped up beside him, her smile bright. "I think Joe would have loved this." Christopher nodded. "I hope so." Ethan ran up and grabbed Christopher's hand. You were right, Chris. Christmas miracles are real. Christopher smiled down at him, his heart full. Yes, Ethan, they are. As the cafe doors finally closed for the night, Christopher lingered by the jukebox, staring at the glowing song titles. He selected a track and let the familiar melody fill the quiet space. It was one of Joe's favorites, Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas. Anna and Ethan stood with him, their heads tilted as they listened. This is just the beginning, Christopher said softly. For all of us. Anna nodded, wrapping her arm around Ethan's shoulders. Together, they stepped outside, the snow falling gently around them, as the glow of the cafe's lights cast a warm circle behind them. Christopher took a deep breath, the crisp air filling his lungs. This was more than a restoration, it was a second chance, a reminder that kindness could ripple through generations, leaving a legacy far beyond what anyone imagined. As they walked through the quiet streets, Ethan's laughter echoed through the night, reminding Christopher of one simple truth. Sometimes, the greatest gifts are not the ones you receive, but the ones you give back. Christmas morning arrived with a quiet beauty. Snow drifted lazily past Christopher's penthouse windows, coating the city in a soft, white blanket. Despite the serene view, his thoughts were elsewhere back at the cafe, where life had burst forth like a long-held breath finally released. He had stayed late after the opening, helping Greg and Anna clean up, as Ethan continued bouncing around, reliving the night's events. By the time he had returned home, the silence of his penthouse had felt even more profound. The cafe's reopening had been a success, but Christopher knew it was just the beginning. The real challenge was ahead, making sure it became the heart of the community again, just as it had been during Joe's time. Later that morning, Christopher made his way to Anna and Ethan's apartment, carrying a gift-wrapped box under his arm. He had thought carefully about what to bring, wanting it to be something meaningful. When Anna opened the door, she smiled warmly. She was still wearing her festive red sweater from the night before, and the smell of cinnamon and pine filled the apartment. "Chris, come in," she said, stepping aside to let him in. Ethan rushed over, his face lighting up at the sight of Christopher. "You're here!" he shouted, grabbing Christopher's hand and tugging him toward the small Christmas tree in the corner. Christopher chuckled. "I promised I'd be here." The small living room was cozy, with twinkling lights wrapped around the tree and handmade ornaments hanging from its branches. There were a few presents under the tree, wrapped in colorful paper with mismatched bows. Ethan plopped onto the floor and picked up a gift labeled with his name. "Can I open one now, Mom?" Anna laughed. "Go ahead." Ethan tore through the paper, revealing a small model train set. His eyes went wide with excitement as he ran his fingers over the miniature engine and cars. "This is awesome!" Christopher smiled at the boy's joy, but his gaze drifted to Anna, who was watching Ethan with quiet pride. She caught his eye and smiled softly. "Thank you for being here," she said. "It means a lot." Christopher reached down and handed her the gift he had brought. "This is for you." Anna hesitated before unwrapping the box. When she opened it, her breath caught. Inside was a framed photograph, a restored version of the old Polaroid Ethan had shown Christopher. The photo of young Christopher and Joe standing in front of the cafe was now crisp and clear, the fading repaired. Anna's eyes shimmered with tears. "Chris, this is beautiful. I thought it should be somewhere you could see it every day," Christopher said softly. "A reminder of everything Joe built and how much he believed in you." Anna nodded, her voice too thick with emotion to speak. She ran her thumb gently across the frame before setting it carefully on the table. "Grandpa would have loved this," Ethan said, still holding one of the train cars. "He always said memories are treasures." Christopher crouched beside Ethan. "Your grandpa was right. Memories remind us of where we came from, but they also show us how far we've come." Ethan's eyes brightened. Like how you went from flipping burgers to owning your own building? Christopher laughed. Exactly. That afternoon, they sat down to a simple but delicious Christmas lunch: roasted chicken, potatoes, and warm rolls. Ethan's excitement kept the conversation lively, and Anna's laughter filled the room like music. It felt like home. Christopher hadn't experienced this kind of warmth in years, just sharing a meal, trading stories, and watching someone else's joy. For so long, he had thought that wealth and status were the ultimate measures of success. But sitting there with Anna and Ethan, he realized how hollow those achievements had been without moments like this to fill them. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Ethan tugged at Christopher's sleeve. "Can we go back to the cafe tonight, please? I want to see it again." Anna looked hesitant. "It's Christmas, Ethan. I'm sure Chris has other plans." But Christopher shook his head. "Actually, I'd like that." Ethan's face lit up. "Yes." The streets were quiet as they walked through the snow. Holiday lights twinkled above the sidewalks, and the air was filled with the faint sounds of distant carolers. Ethan skipped ahead, kicking up puffs of snow with his boots. When they reached the cafe, Christopher paused in front of the glowing neon sign. The sight still filled him with a quiet sense of awe. "Do you want to see something special?" he asked, reaching into his coat pocket for the key. Ethan nodded eagerly. Christopher unlocked the door and pushed it open, the familiar chime of the bell ringing softly. The cafe was empty, but it was just as warm and inviting as the night before. The booths gleamed under the lights, and the jukebox stood silently in the corner, waiting for its next song. Ethan darted inside, spinning in a slow circle as he took it all in again. "It's perfect," he said, his voice almost reverent. Anna stepped in more slowly, her eyes drifting to the small decorations they had placed behind the counter: a jar of candy, a stack of menus, and the framed photo of Joe that Christopher had insisted on hanging. Christopher walked to the jukebox and pressed a button. A soft crackle sounded before a familiar tune began to play. "What a Wonderful World." Anna smiled at the song choice. "My dad loved this one." Christopher nodded. He used to hum it while wiping down the counter. They sat together in one of the booths, sipping cocoa from the cafe's newly polished mugs. Ethan rested his head against Anna's shoulder, his energy finally fading as the quiet of the cafe settled around them. Christopher watched the two of them with a mixture of pride and peace. He had rebuilt the cafe for Joe's memory, but he realized now that he had also rebuilt it for them and for himself. "This place, it feels like him," Anna whispered. Christopher nodded. "Because it is, and it always will be." The door chimed as a young couple entered, their faces bright with curiosity. They looked around and smiled when they saw Christopher at the booth. "Is this Joe's cafe?" the woman asked. Christopher stood and smiled. "It is. Welcome." The couple took a seat near the window, their laughter soft and warm as they studied the menu. Ethan's eyes fluttered open, and he whispered, "People are coming back, Chris. Just like Grandpa wanted." Christopher's heart swelled. "Yes, they are." As the snow continued to fall outside, the cafe's glow cast a warm circle of light onto the street. It wasn't just a cafe, it was a home for memories, kindness, and second chances. Christopher took one last look around, the jukebox humming its soft melody. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about the next business deal or the next achievement. He was thinking about the legacy of one man's kindness and the incredible ripple it had created. The cafe began to take on a life of its own in the days that followed Christmas. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood: Joe's Cafe is back. People arrived at all hours, drawn in by nostalgia, curiosity, and the promise of something familiar. For some, it was the smell of freshly brewed coffee and buttery biscuits that lured them in. For others, it was the warm glow of the neon sign and the memory of mornings spent in the corner booth with a newspaper and a friendly smile from behind the counter. Christopher watched it all unfold with quiet pride. He spent most of his days at the cafe now, helping behind the counter, greeting customers, and taking time to hear their stories. It felt surreal stepping back into a place that had once been his refuge and now felt like his purpose. Anna was there every afternoon after her morning cleaning shift, balancing plates with ease and laughing with customers as if she had been born to it. Ethan was always close by, his notepad in hand, eagerly taking orders and learning the ropes. "Another hot cocoa for table 3, Ethan called from behind the counter one afternoon. Christopher smiled as he poured the cocoa into a ceramic mug and handed it to Ethan. "You're getting faster," he said. Ethan beamed. "I'm learning from the best." The boy's enthusiasm was contagious. Every customer seemed to brighten when Ethan delivered their orders, his freckled face glowing with pride. One afternoon, Margie, one of the cafe's regulars, sat at the counter nursing her coffee. She had been one of Joe's most loyal customers, and she always stayed a little longer than most, lost in her memories. Christopher leaned against the counter, refilling her cup. "How's everything today, Margie?" Margie smiled wistfully. "It's perfect, just like it used to be." She paused, stirring her coffee slowly. "You know, Chris, I didn't realize how much I missed this place until you brought it back." Christopher's expression softened. "Me too," he admitted. Margie's eyes twinkled. "Joe would have been so proud of you." The words hit Christopher in the heart, and he nodded, unable to speak for a moment. "I hope so," he said quietly. As the days passed, the cafe became more than just a place to eat. It became a gathering space for the community. Families came to share breakfast, friends met for afternoon coffee, and older regulars returned to reminisce about the old days. One evening, a group of teenagers from the local high school piled into one of the booths, their laughter filling the air. Anna smiled as she passed them, refilling their drinks. "They remind me of us," she said, glancing at Christopher. "Remember how we used to sit around and talk for hours when we had nowhere else to be?" Christopher chuckled. "I remember Joe pretending to be annoyed when we stayed too long, but slipping us free refills anyway." Anna's eyes softened. "He made everyone feel welcome, no matter who they were or what they were going through." Christopher nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "That's what I want this place to be again, a place where people feel like they belong." Later that evening, after the cafe had closed and the chairs had been stacked, Christopher, Anna, and Ethan sat at the counter with mugs of cocoa. The cafe was quiet now, but the warmth lingered in the air. Ethan leaned forward, his eyes sparkling with curiosity. "Chris, what was it like when you first worked here?" Christopher took a sip of his cocoa, his mind drifting back. "It was overwhelming at first. I was just a kid trying to figure things out. My family was struggling, and I didn't know where I fit in the world." He paused, his voice softening. "But Joe saw something in me. He didn't ask questions. He just gave me an apron and a job." Anna smiled, resting her chin in her hand. "My dad always had a way of seeing the best in people." Christopher nodded. "He made me feel like I mattered. I think that's why I worked so hard. I wanted to make him proud." Ethan's eyes were wide. "You must have been really good at it. Grandpa always said you were his best worker." Christopher chuckled. "I don't know about that, but I tried my best." He grew quiet for a moment. "Joe didn't just give me a job, he gave me hope. When I walked into this cafe, I felt like I had a place in the world." Anna reached over and squeezed his hand. "And now you're giving that to others." Christopher looked around the cafe, his heart full. "That's the goal." The next morning, a small line had already formed outside the cafe before the doors opened. Christopher unlocked the door and greeted the first few customers with a smile. As the day went on, familiar faces returned, along with new ones drawn by the growing word of mouth. At one point, a man with a young daughter approached the counter. He looked nervous, his clothes worn but clean. "Hi," the man said, glancing down at his daughter. "We were just wondering if you had any specials today." Christopher noticed the man's hesitation and the way he held his daughter's small hand protectively. He understood that look all too well. It was the look of someone trying to get by without showing how hard things really were. Christopher smiled warmly. "You're in luck. We've got a special today, hot cocoa, and biscuits are on the house." The man blinked in surprise. "Really?" Christopher nodded. "Really. Grab a booth. I'll bring it over." The man's shoulders relaxed as he guided his daughter to a booth. A few minutes later, Christopher placed 2 mugs of cocoa and a plate of warm biscuits in front of them. "Let me know if you need anything else," Christopher said. The man's eyes glistened with gratitude. "Thank you," he said softly. As Christopher walked back to the counter, he felt a familiar sense of fulfillment. Joe had taught him that kindness didn't need a reason, it was simply what you did when someone needed it. Ethan watched from behind the counter, his face filled with admiration. "That was really nice, Chris." Christopher ruffled Ethan's hair. "That's what your grandpa would have done." Ethan smiled proudly. "I'm going to be like him when I grow up." Christopher's heart swelled at the boy's words. "You already are." That night, as Christopher locked the doors and stepped out into the quiet, snow-covered street, he felt something shift inside him. He had spent years chasing wealth and status, thinking that success was defined by numbers and accolades. But standing there, watching the cafe's warm lights glow against the dark sky, he knew the truth. Success wasn't about what you built for yourself, it was about what you built for others. Joe's Cafe wasn't just a place, it was a reminder that kindness, connection, and belonging could change lives. And now, thanks to one small boy and a memory that refused to fade, Christopher had found his way back to what truly mattered. New Year's Eve arrived, and the cafe buzzed with life as the neighborhood gathered for one final celebration of the season. Outside, the snow continued to fall, softening the sounds of the busy city. But inside Joe's Cafe, it was warm and alive with laughter and music. Christopher stood behind the counter, tying a crisp apron around his waist. He watched as Ethan darted from table to table, delivering mugs of cocoa and greeting customers with his usual enthusiasm. Anna moved effortlessly among the tables, her face glowing with joy as she refilled drinks and shared stories with regulars. The jukebox hummed in the background, playing a familiar tune, "What a Wonderful World." Christopher took a deep breath, savoring the scene. The cafe had become exactly what he hoped it would be, a place where people felt like they belonged. As the evening wore on, more people arrived, filling every booth and counter stool. Families and friends squeezed together, sharing plates of warm pastries and toasting with hot drinks. The energy in the room was contagious, hopeful, and bright, like the promise of a new beginning. Greg arrived with his wife and 2 young children, waving at Christopher as they found a spot near the mural-covered wall. "This place looks amazing," Greg called out. Christopher waved back with a grin. "Thanks, Greg. I couldn't have done it without you." Greg held up a mug of coffee and a silent toast. Ethan climbed up on a chair near the jukebox, clapping his hands to get everyone's attention. "Hey, everybody!" he shouted, his voice carrying over the crowd. "Chris says there's a surprise at midnight." Laughter rippled through the room as people turned their attention to Christopher, who shook his head and smiled. Anna raised an eyebrow. "Oh? A surprise?" Christopher chuckled, stepping forward. "Leave it to Ethan to spoil the suspense," he joked. "But yes, there is something I'd like to say before we ring in the new year." The room quieted as everyone turned toward him. The soft glow of the cafe lights illuminated familiar faces, friends, neighbors, and strangers who had become a part of something bigger. Christopher cleared his throat, his voice steady but full of emotion. "When I first walked into this cafe as a teenager, I didn't know where I belonged. My family was struggling, and I was angry at the world. But Joe, he saw something in me. He gave me a job and a place to be. And more than that, he gave me hope." Anna's eyes shimmered as she listened, and Ethan leaned forward, hanging on every word. Christopher continued, When I left to chase my dreams, I forgot how much this place and Joe had given me. I thought success was about money and titles. But coming back here, I realized that success isn't about what you earn. It's about the lives you touch. A soft murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Christopher smiled. This cafe isn't just a tribute to Joe. It's a promise to carry forward the kindness he showed to everyone who walked through these doors. He glanced at Anna and Ethan. And it's a reminder that it's never too late to come home. The crowd burst into applause, and a few people wiped their eyes. Anna reached for Christopher's hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "Thank you, Chris," she whispered. Ethan jumped down from the chair and threw his arms around Christopher's waist. "That was awesome," Christopher laughed, hugging the boy tightly. As midnight approached, someone began a countdown, and the room filled with excitement. 10, 9, 8. The jukebox's lights twinkled in time with the music, and the cafe seemed to hum with anticipation. 3, 2, 1. Happy New Year! The room erupted in cheers as people raised their mugs and hugged one another. The sound of laughter and celebration filled every corner. Anna kissed Ethan's cheek and pulled him close. "Happy New Year, sweetheart," she whispered. Christopher watched them with a warmth in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. When Anna turned to him, her smile soft, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. "Happy New Year, Chris," she said. He smiled. "Happy New Year, Anna." After the celebration began to wind down and the cafe emptied out, Christopher, Anna, and Ethan stayed behind to clean up. The cafe was quiet now, but it still felt full of memories, laughter, and the quiet hum of new beginnings. Ethan yawned as he stacked chairs, his energy finally running out. "Go sit down," Anna said gently, guiding him to a booth. "You've earned a break." Ethan flopped onto the seat with a sleepy grin. "Best New Year's ever," he mumbled. Christopher leaned on the counter, watching Anna as she wiped down the tables. "You've made this place feel alive again," he said. Anna looked up, a soft smile on her face. "We did this together." Christopher nodded, his heart full. "You and Ethan, you're the heart of this place." Anna stepped closer, resting her hand on the counter. "So are you. Joe would be so proud of what you've done, Chris." Christopher's throat tightened at her words. "I hope so," he whispered. Anna's gaze was steady. "I know so." When the last light was turned off and the doors were locked, the three of them stepped out into the snowy street. The cafe's neon sign cast a warm, glowing circle on the ground. Joe's Cafe, a beacon in the quiet night. Ethan walked ahead, kicking up puffs of snow as he hummed a Christmas tune. Anna and Christopher followed behind, their footsteps slow and steady. As they reached the corner, Christopher paused, looking back at the cafe one last time. The sight of the glowing sign filled him with a quiet peace. Anna followed his gaze. "It's home again, isn't it?" Christopher smiled. "Yeah, it is." She linked her arm through his, and they continued walking, their breath rising in soft clouds in the cold air. The sound of Ethan's laughter rang out ahead of them, bright, hopeful, and full of life. Christopher took a deep breath, feeling the crisp air fill his lungs. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about what was next. He wasn't measuring his success by contracts or quarterly reports. He was home. As the snow fell gently outside the cafe, the sign continued to glow, a reminder of one man's kindness and the ripple effect it created. Sometimes, the greatest gift isn't wealth or status, it's finding your way back to what matters most. And for Christopher Preston, home was never about a place, it was about the people who welcomed you in and gave you hope. As the snow continued to fall outside Joe's Cafe, Christopher's story reminds us all of something truly timeless, the power of kindness, resilience, and second chances. A small act of generosity can change someone's life in ways we may never fully realize. This tale of hope and homecoming shows that no matter how far we stray, it's never too late to return to the people and places that shaped us. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like this video and share it with someone who could use a little inspiration today. And if you enjoy stories that uplift and remind us of the goodness in the world, be sure to subscribe to our channel. We'd love to hear from you. What's the most meaningful act of kindness you've ever experienced? Share your story in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and from all of us here, we wish you a warm, joyful season, filled with hope and second chances. See you in the next story.